I'm resident of Collinwood for YouTube. Joel Sains, joined by my buddy Gordon Dymowski, my buddy Patrick McCray. We're here to talk about the movie The Ninth Configuration, starring Stacy Keach. Scott Wilson of The Walking Dead fame does a really, really amazing job in this movie. I know he's listed as the co-star, but it more feels like Scott Wilson is somewhat the star of this movie. No offense to Stacy Keach. What do you guys think about that? Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, yeah, that's a tough question to ask. You know, if you're just looking at line count, yeah, Scott Wilson has far more dialogue, and he is the character on whom the movie works. You know, but from a structural point of view, it's very interesting because if you define a story by who makes, you know, whose story is it, you know, who makes the biggest decision in the movie, and the biggest decision is made by Stacy Keach's character, by Colonel Kane. It's hard to
Yeah.
tell. It's you know, it's sort of like Beckett and Henry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind is that this came out in 1980. Scott Wilson wasn't a name. Stacy Keach was.
Yeah. Yeah. Stacy Keach was a very big name in the 80s. You're right. But Scott
And
really.
in the well, I was just going to say in the, you know, the novel that it was initially based on, Twinkle Twinkle Killer Kane. You know, Kane is literally the titular character, and it was a project that had bounced around for a long time. Charlton Heston had it for a while and kept trying to get it made into a movie. I think in the late 60s, early 70s. I don't remember when the book was written, but shortly after it came out.
Yeah. It's a really interesting movie. The castle is in Germany that they use for this movie. The shot that they use, the castle, the shots that they use. The studio that the courtyard scenes are filmed in Budapest, Hungary, in Budapest. Uh, really, really well shot and well produced. I like how they open this movie with a rocket and the moon is coming up and you have this countdown. Then it's you hear like the abort sound, and then Scott Wilson's character is getting dragged out of the ship, and then he wakes up in the mental institution, and you hear the then you hear the voiceover of the story of the castle, of that there's actually
Yeah.
military mental hospitals around the world. Now there are less of them now, but there by the time this story is told, but this castle, this military mental institution does things very differently than the others, which I like. Um, and spoiler alert for no one has seen it, the hospital is run by Kane's brother, who's a doctor in the hospital. Um, what did you guys think of the setting of the movie? This beautiful, beautiful castle.
It's fantastically atmospheric and gothic. You know, I have not given it, even though I've thought about this movie for 35 years. I haven't really given the significance of the castle a lot of thought, except that it is, inherently, it's a Gothic building, and so when we think of Gothic, we think of these institutions dying, and the only really old institution in the movie is the church, but it's very affirmational about the church. So it is a, Mark Kermode talks about this being a film that's unlike any other. There's no comparison. It combines all these weird elements together. So, a lot of the artistic rules that we would apply to say, oh, well, this is symbolic of that. Maybe, I'm sure people can find it. But sometimes they're just one of the most interesting, evocative combinations of things we can put together. I don't know, Gordon, what do you think?
Well, I could think it gives the movie a little bit more of an edge because most movies of this type would take place in your traditional hospital setting. And the hospital setting would, I think, take out not only kind of the weird surrealism of it, but you would just think, oh, they're reacting this way. They are in a mental hospital. With a castle, part of it was strictly financial. It's kind of like similar to a situation with Circle of Iron, where they go to a country because the country has money that needs to be spent only in that country.
Yeah.
Blatty got funding from Pepsi, and Pepsi had dedicated funds in Budapest that they needed to spend. So that's why it was filmed in there. And I think the castle gives it a weird kind of, it makes it seem more real. You can't easily go okay, well, they're all just dealing with issues.
If it's in a, sorry.
I was about to say the castle gives it a little bit more of a, I say realistic, but there's a groundedness, but there's also an atmosphere to it. They're reenacting The Great Escape. You can't do that in a traditional hospital.
If it were set in a traditional hospital, it would feel much more like this is a supervised governmental kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And being able to get away with all the stuff that they get away with just wouldn't be possible. Here, it's sort of the army, wants to look into this or wants to say they're looking into it, but they have, they sort of want to keep this way off the books. And in a movie that is so irreverent, for me, it's amazingly pro-military in a good sense. It is a world in which the U.S. military would devote money to something like that, even if it's ostensibly to figure out if they're faking it. They're still not just throwing them away. This is a place for geniuses who are having this odd phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is set right like with the Vietnam War, that they're wondering with the Vietnam War, or some of these people, you're right, or some of these people faking it. And now again, Scott Wilson's character is an astronaut, and some of the other people in the hospital were in Vietnam War. Now Killer Kane, if you will, Stacy Keach's character, he was in Vietnam. We're gonna find that out later. He comes there under a very false pretense that he is in charge of the hospital. He's the doctor in charge of the hospital. They're thinking, hey, the bosses showed up. All right. I was actually, that's the one thing I'll say about this movie, because I'd never read the book. I just watched this movie cold. I was pleasantly surprised.
And there are 2 books.
I was pleasantly surprised with the plot twist in this movie. But what did you guys think about it? Because you know about it more than I do.
Well, I had never seen this movie before.
About
Patrick
what?
recommended.
Oh, okay, sir.
So, Joel, what's the question specifically?
Oh, my question is, what did you guys think of the plot twist with Stacy Keach's character, Killer Kane, that he's coming there under the pretense that he's going to be in charge of this place. He's a doctor, but we know that's not the case. That he's not a doctor at all. He's a cold-blooded murderer. So, what did you guys think of that?
Well, he's a cold-blooded murderer, but I mean, he's also in the military, and it's their job, in the words, you won't hear me say this very often, in the words of Rush Limbaugh, to kill people and break things. And so, but he's not in this film as a cold-blooded murderer. He's there as a patient. All of the weird indulgent role play stuff that he does is being done for him by his brother, which is mild conflict of interest. But late 60s, early 70s, when the movie takes place. The plot twist. I saw the movie when I was about 15. And I was less observant than I am now at trying to assess these things. And I can say I was blown away. And the transformation that Keach has in the bar was genuinely the prelude to one of the most exhilarating scenes I had ever seen in a movie up to that point. I mean, it was like sticking my finger in a light socket.
Yeah. It really does a good job too of when he's posing as a doctor. He actually does try and talk to the other patients, including Scott Wilson's character. He says, why'd you abort the launch? Why didn't you want to go in outer space? And Scott Wilson's character doesn't really answer him, which again, if he did right away, it would sort of ruin the aspect of the movie. But I love Scott Wilson's question to Stacy Keach's Kane's character. He goes, if you get to the other side, will you try to show me signs that there's an afterlife? And Stacy Keach's character is like, yeah. And I'm thinking, wow, that's a really, number one, it's an odd request, but it's such a powerful request to make, for the other character to ask.
It was, yeah, there's a lot of history to that question. I mean, that was what Houdini, tried to do with Bess, or said he would try to do. And that's why all those seances were held, every year, because he said he was going to try to do that. And it is a religious movie that is more respectful of atheists and the atheist standpoint than anything that's ever been made. Sort of like only Nixon could go to China. Only a hardcore Catholic could make a movie that would be meaningful for atheists. And I'll tell you, practical questions like, okay, you say there's a heaven. Well, if there's a heaven, send me a sign. For those of us who are less steeped in belief than others, is a very normal question. That's the first thing that would and it's a very trusting question too. An important point to get to, or to get back to, he's not pretending he's a psychiatrist. He really thinks he is his brother. He really thinks he is a psychiatrist. He's not pretending in that sense, or he's pretending on such a deep level that he's not even consciously aware of it.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm going to go back to the plot twist, because I think Joe, you might have given it a little bit of discredit. This is the first time I've seen it, and I've actually watched the movie twice. It's not the way that the lead up, everything points, and I mean this sincerely, everything points to the twist happening. You just don't realize that it's happening. I mean, M. Night Shyamalan should have watched this movie, because it's, and then when you watch it the first time, and you have to keep in mind with Stacy Keach, he's coming in, his Kane is not, as Patrick said, he's not, oh, okay, I'm going to think I'm a psychiatrist, but I'm really a killer. He is trying to deny that part of his past. That's why he is so gentle and so affirming. And when he's talking with Scott Walker's character, it becomes, well, if there's evil in the world, surely the good people mean that there's good in the world. That this is, I think that Scott Walker's character, his big concern is if he goes out into space, he'll die alone, because he's trying to find they're both men who are trying to find some kind of meaning. I think Scott Walker's character is probably a little bit more existential, a little bit more, atheistic for lack of a better term. Whereas I think that Kane is much more of a trying to find the divine. And when that twist happens, there's no big fanfare. There's no big, in fact, the twist occurs twice. Once when the Ed Flanders character says, I'm really his brother. He's a patient here. And that means that I think all the other and it suggests that all the other inmates, including Dark Shadows producer George DiCenzo, are kind of engaging in this to help Kane through. But the bar scene and the fight scene, that's where you see Kane kind of go, okay, I tried being nice. I tried doing this. I got to go back to being that guy for one moment for survival. So I don't think it's like, it's not like a Shyamalan, here's a twist, yay. It's set up so beautifully. And even in this twist, there's also the back and forth about, God and evil. And I think that, I mean, it was a tough film for me to watch. Part of it is I've just been going through some stuff, but as someone who grew up Catholic, I can appreciate that it's almost like Kevin Smith's Dogma. It's about the writer trying to figure out, okay, what's going on here through these two other characters.
Yeah, I think again, I wasn't trying to. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say. Actually, let's bookmark this. What I was gonna say is when Kane flips. So I just bookmark that. Joel, what were you gonna say?
Well, I wasn't trying to give the impression that it's something that just happens. When Kane arrives there, you're right. He believes that he's a psychiatrist. He's there. He believes he's there to help people. He's the greatest thing you can do. Somebody once said is deceive yourself in a sense. He's not deceiving himself to lie to himself or to lie to others. His mind has sort of buried the killer within his own self-conscious. To quote Dr. Loomis, evil. We're all afraid of the darkness inside ourselves. Well, what would you do with your own darkness? Would you bury it or would you embrace it? Killer Kane buries it in every way in this movie. And he does a very good job of doing that by being this psychiatrist who's trying to help people. And he's very gentle. He's very hands-on with his patients. He's very nice to them. He tries to show that there's good in man. There's good in human beings. And Scott Wilson's character is more like, bullshit, come on. Scott Wilson's character, he's the yin to Stacy Keach's character's yang, if you will. He's very defiant in a lot of this, which I like. Again, if you're going to have, to be clear, neither man's a heel in a sense, but they're both very shades of gray character, which I like. And to me, I think there's more than two moments where the Kane character flips in a sense, or is flipping. There's the moment in the church. There's a moment in the church where Stacy Keach's character is praying, and he sees this little altar boy looking back at him, which it's him. It's him looking back at himself. And I think he's coming to, and he's got this sort of evil, the boy has got this evil looking look. And I think that's sort of the evil trying to come to the front forward. But he just ignores it. He just puts it off as nothing, in my opinion. And then later, it's taught when the one guy recognizes him, and then that's when the doctors get together, and they say, okay, he had a relapse. We have to, for the sake of himself and the sake of humanity, we have to let him pretend that he's a psychiatrist here. You'll say you were mistaken to the other patients. His brother is saying that. And then the doctors all say, so you've been in charge here this whole time. And he goes, yes, I'm the one in charge here. But we have to let him believe he's the one in charge here. And I love, at the time this conversation is going on, Scott Wilson's character is at the bar. And this is where the movie really, if you had any doubt that this character, that Stacy Keach's character was, because again, the mind can be a very deceptive thing with psychology. Is because the one thing I learned from Jacob's Ladder, the movie Jacob's Ladder, is what you're seeing real. I sort of questioned when I watched this movie. Okay, is Stacy Keach's character really this cold-blooded killer? Because I picked up on that right away. Like, okay, did Killer Kane really just commit cold-blooded murder? I'm not so sure. I'm not completely sold on it yet. And when he goes to the bar, and then they're doing what they're doing, the people who are causing the fight, I'm thinking, okay, this guy is doing everything they asked him to do, Stacy Keach's character, to get out of there without a physical altercation. He's basically trying to show Scott Wilson's character, hey, these people will let us go. And they don't. And then they start roughhousing him. And then that's when he flips, the switch flips. And like you said, for survival. And it's one of the best and most deserved ass kickings I've seen in a movie ever.
Yeah. And let me kind of maybe put Kane's experience in kind of a different context, mostly just to kind of flesh it out a little bit. Kane served in Vietnam. In Vietnam, I was a child towards the latter end of the war. It was not a popular war. It was a very divisive war. And actually, there are people, you'd have people say, oh, it's not a war, it's a police action. So a lot of the people who went to Nam, and I had a lot of relatives who went to Nam. I have some friends who went to Nam. They experienced some stuff. And, as Patrick said, war is about, killing people and breaking things. Sometimes you do things in war that you don't, that are, that just astound you. Kane probably did what he did because in that mind it was for survival. But I think on some level his mind just said, okay, this is just because he talks about cutting off a kid's head with a wire. Yeah. And I think at that point he just went, that's when it started. So I think all throughout the movie there's that, okay, I'm my brother, I'm a healer, I'm not this guy. And what's starting to happen is that is starting to come to the forefront. I also think there might be a little bit of PTSD because I think at the bar, he's getting, political commentary. He's getting triggered. He's trying to do his best to get out. It's not what he's used to. So I don't think it's, if he were really that cold blooded, I don't think he would have had that kind of fight to delude himself. He'd just be like, oh, okay, yeah, I kill people. Deal with it.
Yeah. It's a really, really well-paced psychological movie. I'd put it up there with any psychological movie I've seen. It's really well shot. I love the castle sequence. I love how they shoot this movie. I love the cast. I love when Kane's character shows up and they're all standing there. And his brother, the guy who plays his brother, he's like, well, you're in charge now. He goes, I'm going to go get some eggs later. He's like, I'm going to go get some eggs, Benedict. And Benedict, you want to go get some eggs? And he's like, no, I want to go lay down. I want to go rest. So I love the movie you guys recommended here. I'll say this because it's a really, really fun watch. I'm going to give this a solid 10. Simply because it's really, really great. I don't know why Rotten Tomatoes only gives this 80%. I think most of those guys are on drugs. But that's just my opinion. With this movie, Stacy Keach he's a great actor, no doubt. And I know, again, in the 80s, Stacy Keach was a star, but Scott Wilson really comes into his own in this movie. And that's not always the most easiest thing to do for an actor, but he really does. It's really great to see when you have a star and a co-star who both shine at the same time. What do you guys think? Go ahead. Sorry. Patrick, you there?
There is, I'm right here.
Okay.
There is so much ground to. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes.
Am I okay? Well, there's so much ground to cover. You just said the past 5-10 minutes. There's so much to unpack. I don't even know where to begin. Not that anything was wrong or anything, but yeah, this is. I talked about any one dimension of this movie for a long time. So I would really almost need to recap everything just to figure out where to start. There was one place where I have a different perspective, and that's the memory that he has of himself as a child.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting one because I don't know who he's seeing when he's hearing the name Vincent, which is his real name. We see a kid, and so if we're seeing it from his point of view, who he's seeing is his brother Hudson. Although his mother is calling out his name, but whatever that's about, I don't see the child as sinister at all. That was Blatty's son, who I think may have died. But that was that's a very happy memory. That's a memory of innocence. That's a memory of maybe who the actual kind Vincent Caine is, or him looking at his brother Hudson, one or the other. But I see that as very that the idea of childhood is quietly resonant in the movie. I mean, not only do they all sort of experience very childlike regressions with the role play and everything else, but the Caine didn't just kill one person with a wire. He was famous for it. Cutshaw, who's an astronaut, knows about this. That's Killer Caine. He'll cut off your head with a wire. So he was, pretty much the Army's most notorious commando in the Vietnam War, and the most bloodthirsty. And that one of his, I think, breaks is, started to kill kids. And, I think that's reminiscent. I believe I'm getting my history of My Lai massacre and just and that's a whole racist thing where, dealing with Asians, I think made them less people. Because you didn't hear about stuff like that in World War II, because they looked like us. And so I think that idea that I have completely unpersoned these people, it was just even more horrific to Caine. But then when he did it to a kid, that was just before. And the way the movie's timeline kind of reconstructs it, the snake come through with the paperwork screw up, and which is really shortly before the movie takes place. So those events are, I think probably within maybe just a few weeks at most. That they put this into action pretty quickly. Blatty's maybe my favorite author, certainly one of them, one of the top 3 or 4, and one of the most influential on me. And Blatty's central argument about God got quoted here. And it's something that Blatty would say again and again in interviews in wording that completely is either out of ninth configuration or vice versa. But, if you're going to use, all of this evil in the world as evidence that there's no God, what do you do with all of the goodness in the world? And even for a secular person, it is so easy to fall into excessive pessimism and negativity about humans because we provide a lot of ammo for that. Yeah. And yet, I think the thing that haunts people the most, and talk about something you can either embrace or you can run away from, is the baffling existence of good and the impulse to do good even when it doesn't make sense, and the necessity of that. And one of the things that really makes me feel good about being a member of the secular community is that whether it's from God and we're just not hearing it, or whether it's a part of human nature that cynics are just going to have to deal with, we can be good and we can do the right thing, and that there is a real of meaning in life when we choose to do something proper and good and kind and give, and that yeah, we may have messy motivations somewhere in there, but and we may end up stabbed by a biker metaphorically for doing it, but the impulse to do that is so important. It's funny because I'm told by a lot of Christians that and this is not me bragging or anything, but in my comportment in a lot of times of difficulty, I'm more Christian than they are, just in seeing a necessity for charity, and third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th. It's that because when you're dealing with people who are in trouble, and they say, listen, I just need one more chance. One of the reasons I ask people to pause before turning a cold shoulder to them is that everyone who ever cleaned up their act also said to someone at one point, listen, I just need one more chance. It's indeed true. Someone rolled their eyes and said, okay, I'll do it. And this movie for me was very influential on that philosophy. And you get screwed a lot, but you're doing it for more than just yourself. You're doing it for the team. Blatty was a Teilhardian. He was very influenced by a guy named Teilhard de Chardin, who is mentioned briefly in the movie. Cutshot gets a book off the shelf and says, and quotes the title of How I Believe by Teilhard. And Teilhard believed that we shared a soul, and that every time you made a good choice, every time you were engaged in good, you were involved in permanently removing some of the evil from that soul, and that we as a race are living somewhere with that. And even if you look at it secularly, I think it's true that in general we as a species are improving. And sometimes you're just doing it out of some weird call for the species. And I really believe that. I mean, Ray Bradbury had a great quote where he said, if you look at human evolution in terms of like even 100 years or 50 years, 20 years, everything's always getting worse. But if you look at it in chunks of 600 years, 700 years, everything's actually getting better. Evidence that I would give would be our evolved attitudes towards gender, towards the necessity of universal literacy, things like that. That of course, people have a right to learn to read, and we have greater percentage of population reading than ever. That talk about Catholic, that was once just the purview of monks, not anymore. And so I really respect that, and I respond to that. That's, the movie ends with that St. Christopher medal, and the idea that, because I contended with that for a long time, because I thought, well, as a secular guy, am I betraying my beliefs? by being moved by that. And no, and to me, that St. Christopher medal is just a statement that, don't worry, there's a point. And even if the point is just it's better to be a good person than a bad person, there's a point. Because I know far too many good people who just are mean and will judge people rather than exercising curiosity, and will be the first to misuse the word boundaries when really they're just being selfish and they're just trying to control others or use some weird excuse to ignore what they honestly know is the right thing to do, and what the very scripture that they claim to often represent tells them to do. My God, right up there with the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths is Book of Matthew, and even a secular person can recognize that the world's a better place when you apply some of those ideas. Now, if you do that to the extent that the host organism is going to die and people aren't going to get anything out of it, well, then no, that's a bad thing. However, in the case of this movie, although the host organism, Cain, does perish through his goodness, and how he perishes is a very important question because there are two different cuts of the movie. But Cutshaw is restored, and they were looking at a world where neither Cutshaw nor Cain were going to make it. And so, at least in this sense, one of them will make it. And there's a divide in the movie. There are two different cuts. There's one where it's clear that Hudson has killed himself, and he says that. And then there's one where not Hudson, Vincent has killed himself, and it's one where the biker's knife slipped in and it just happened. I prefer the just happened, and he lets himself. He's like, I'm too far gone. This will provide the shock therapy that is necessary for this to happen. The book ends really beautifully after the stuff, the St. Christopher medal and so on. It has this "where are they now" kind of paragraph. And the last thing in the book is about Marvin Groper, who is the toughest of the Marines who are in charge of these guys. He's the real mean-spirited, foul-mouthed one at the beginning of the movie. However, he's also the one who tells the cops, you're not taking him anywhere. And as it turns out, just has a heart, the size of Canada. And the last thing in the book is this report, if I'm recalling correctly, that Marvin Groper jumped on a hand grenade. He went back to Vietnam and jumped on a hand grenade to save the guys in his squad, which is exactly the cliched thing that Colonel Cain brings up to Cutshaw, and seems so hackneyed. But the way Blatty buttons it with that sometimes these things really do happen. He says, Cutshaw, these things happen all the time. Is just such a beautiful moment of writing. And there is, by the way, an Exorcist connection to this movie. Cutshaw appears in The Exorcist. He is the astronaut at the party where Father Dyer is at the piano and singing, and Reagan comes down and loses control of her bladder and just stares at him and says, "You're going to die up there." That's the event that triggers his fear on the launch pad. Yeah. So that's the weird kind of thing. So those are my brief thoughts on Ninth Configuration.
Gordon, what do you think, man?
I think this is a very deep movie. I mean, it's hard to. I think it does a couple of really things really well. I think it handles that kind of the conflict between, as Patrick said, that kind of feeling about being, wanting to reach for some kind of higher ideal in terms of a theistic God approach, and the other is a more secular kind of a existential approach. And I like that the film lets those arguments work themselves out without necessarily coming on one side or the other.
Yes.
There's never. It's not like I'm trying to think of it's not like a pure. I think a more modern example would be a pure flick film, where it would be like, you should believe in God. If you don't believe in God, you're gonna go to hell. In many ways, it reminded me, and this is a really, really deep cut. There was a television show throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s called Insight, and it was put on by the Paulist Productions, which is the Paulist order of priests. And in the Catholic Church, they believed that the way that you spread, that you kind of spread your message is through media. It's through channels. And the great thing about Insight, especially when you look at the 70s and 80s stuff, and there's an entire channel of Insight. A lot of times there'd be no God comment. It would just be about dealing with issues like, okay, it would deal with like after school special stuff, but it was that tension of how can I be authentic in a world where those values are challenged. Mm-hmm. And I think with Kane and with Cutshaw, what you have is you've got one man who is facing the fact that he did some traumatic stuff, and he's had to dissociate and kind of repress that in order just to function. And he had to basically pretend to be his brother because he couldn't deal with that. And with Cutshaw, part of the reason why he freaks out before his moon landing, and he says this towards the end, is, I didn't want to go all the way up there into empty space and die alone. And I think it's this wanting connection and wanting to approach, it's like it's the central thesis, if there's evil in the world, why is there good? And I think it's that great tension between to put it simply, there are I know people who are atheists who always get if you're an atheist, then how do you know right from wrong? Well, right from wrong because there are just some things. It's like treating people with dignity and respect and compassion. Like that, you don't need to believe in God or a Bible. Whereas I think
if the only reason you're doing the right thing is because you're afraid of going to hell, you're a bad person.
Right.
I'll pass judgment on that. If that's your reason, if you can't tell that killing people and stealing things and defrauding them is wrong, just innately, something's seriously wrong.
Yeah, and I think too, it also shows that, like, I like the fact that it shows from Kane's perspective, a man struggling to deal with spiritual issues without being that as someone who grew up Catholic and who's a recovering Catholic, it's very easy to see it as, you do it in the Bible, you've got the Gospels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a difference between spouting canon, biblical canon, and looking at the real core of the message. And when you look throughout the New Testament, Jesus only has one commandment: love thy neighbor. Old Testament, you've got 10 rules. Moses brings them down. And not only that, in Catholic thinking, Jesus not only said that, but he radicalized the law. And yeah, we're going to get a little theological. Bear with me. There's a story in several of the Gospels about, Jesus becomes a blind man, and blind man's like, "Hey, please cure me," and so he does. In one of the books, and I'm not sure which one, Jesus spits on the ground, makes a paste, and puts it on the guy's eyes. And the Pharisees, who are kind of the enforcers of religious law, said, "Aha! You worked on the Sabbath. J'accuse. You're bad." Whereas, I think Christ would have said, "Hey, look, dude, that's not really work. That's not what the law means." But I think with the Ninth Configuration, it handles these issues in a very tactile way. It's not just okay, well, you've got your religious guy, you've got your atheist, let's argue. It's not Phil Donahue and Matthew Murray O'Hare. It's about go ahead.
No, I was saying one of the great ways that it accomplishes that is that at no point does Cain say you're wrong. At no point does Cain even say necessarily I disagree with you. Do any of that. Cain just offers. He says, "Well, there are arguments from reason." That's his opening salvo, and I was like, "Okay, well, you have my attention." And then he simply offers alternatives. He offers ways to look at it, but he doesn't say, "And by the way, if you don't do this, something bad's going to happen to you." And that is one of the best lessons on pedagogy, especially in dealing with theological cross discussions, I've ever seen. And it's been a good guide for me in how to approach people of faith.
I think too with this movie that when you talk about the Exorcist connection with Scott Wilson's character, Regan being possessed by whatever demon devil coming down, you're going to die up there. That's somebody who's the possession, the demon or whatever, saying that to Scott Wilson's character is saying it to invoke fear and saying it to cause doubt, and it is in every way judging him for just being a human. Whereas Cain's character, I agree with you, he's not judging him at all. I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to pass judgment. I'm here to talk. And I'm also here to listen to you, to what you have to say to me. And I think that's one of the best. That's what makes this movie so good too. It's every bit the psychological journey you'd want to see told. And it does that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that psychological aspect works even if you don't know the Exorcist connection.
Right.
Because Cutshaw actually does have a valid fear. It's, if he's going off into space and he's going off on a solo mission, something happens and he doesn't have contact with Earth, he will die alone. And you don't necessarily need to that's not an issue of, you could believe in God Almighty and still have that fear, because you're, if you want to die with at least knowing that you said goodbye to the people you love, you said goodbye to the people who care about you, and that it's not, that you don't want to be in basically a big metal top heading thousands of miles in empty space.
Yeah. Really, really great movie. Really amazing ending. Is there anything you guys want to add about the Ninth Configuration?
Go see it. Track down, if you can, as many different cuts as you can. There are some things that are considered definitive cuts, but Blatty himself, towards the end, is who would distribute the movie. I worked at a movie theater and we played Ninth Configuration. We got it from Blatty. And he was always tinkering with it. Did tons of different cuts, at least 4 distinct different cuts of the movie. So, and 2 book versions. There's Twinkle Twinkle Killer Kane, which is far more of a comedy, because Blatty was a protege of Groucho's. He was a very funny writer. One of the things about this movie is it's incredibly funny. And this is the guy who wrote the best Pink Panther movie, Shot in the Dark. And his films are full of one-line. Exorcist, Kinderman is just one-liner after another. So, so the first book is more Doctor Strangelove like, and then the second book was done in tandem with the release of the movie, and so it's almost a fleshed out novelization, but it's done by the guy who wrote the movie and directed the movie. So yeah, I think it's easily the best William Peter Blatty movie and story, and I think Blatty would agree. The one thing I would suggest, if you like it, is to read Blatty's autobiography of his early life, specifically about his mother, who was just nuts, but about how, in a good way, and about how the events that led him to be a person of faith. And it's a book called "I'll Tell Them I Remember You," and it's a book of stunning hilarity and quiet beauty. So,
Gordon?
I think this is probably one of the most underrated yet intellectually provocative films. You can find a version on Tubi. I think you can find a version on YouTube that is of dubious legality, and I don't know if it's a different cut than the one on Tubi. But yeah, it is worth checking out.
Probably.
Yeah. This movie is definitely worth checking out. It's on Tubi for free. You can watch it there. You can pick up the DVD if you want. It's really, really worth it if you do. Just a great watch. Even if you're not aware of the Exorcist connection, great watch. Because
I mean, if you just want to watch it as a comedy with an action ending, okay.
Yeah. Really, I'm surprised again with this movie. There's the fact that you have that much psychology in such a great short amount of time. It's not like this is a long movie, and I sort of missed that where we're now in this. Well, let's show a 3 hour long movie, like Avengers or some shit. With this, it's not a 3 hour long movie.
There is more that happens in any half hour of this movie than in the entire MCU canon.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, you're right. There is, and it's so great to see that though too. You don't have to have a 3 hour long movie. You can have this length long of a movie and tell a great story and get a great message out of it.
And the other nice thing too is that it's so well written. You probably get like 4 or 5 hours worth of movie in 2 hours.
Yeah.
Whereas in MCU, you get like maybe 40 minutes of a TV series in 3 hours. So.
Yeah, and it is, as someone who's lived with it for about 35 years, maybe almost 40 years, it is infinitely rewatchable. I probably watch this movie 3 or 4 times a year, and I have for 35 years or so.
Okay, I'm going to ask a fun question with this before we go. Okay, Killer Kane. You can have Killer Kane kick any fictional character's ass. Who is it? There you go.
I refuse to answer that question. I think you're cheapening the character in the movie, Joel. I'm sorry. No, not going there.
I'm really not.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I appreciate the respect for his fighting prowess in that. I definitely respect that. Jewel, who would you want to see him take on?
to give like the biggest ass kick. Michael Myers. I mean, come on.
Michael Myers, sure. Yeah, and
Yeah.
and I don't think Michael Myers would be getting up from that fight.
No, I don't think he would either.
Yeah, but then
Yeah.
again, my grandmother could kick Michael Myers' ass. You know, grab her shotgun, boom. You know, there you go.
Well, you're Chicago people. You
Yeah.
can do that. I mean, I just respect that. That's just a fact. That's a biological fact. It's like, yeah, and a brontosaurus can kill a mouse. Yeah, because that's what a Chicagoan is versus most other humans.
Hmm.
So hats off to Chicago.
Okay, when are you guys good for another Dark Shadows Daybook episode?
Whenever you like. What episode do you have in mind?
Well, it's your turn to pick, Patrick. Is Monday good for both of you?
Yep, Monday's good for me.
Yeah. Let's do the hang on. It's right there. It's right there. What is the episode where Barnabas chooses not? You know that one? It's where, he comes back and here's Victoria. He's about to cut off Jeff's face or something, and Lang has to leave and say, "Oh, I'll be with you in a minute." And said, "Now, Barnabas, you do the right thing, cut off Jeff Clark's face." And he goes out in the other room, and then Barnabas overhears things, and it's one of those great decisive Barnabas moments. It's like in the 500s, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll figure it out. That one, that episode.
Yeah, I'll message it to you guys later. We'll go with the episode Patrick chose. So is 10:30 good for you guys Monday night?
Yep. Yeah,
Absolutely.
All right. Links to Gordon Dymowski's Amazon page will be in the description box. Links to the Dark Shadows Daybook audio will be in the description box. Go pick that up. Guys, you have a great night. I'll see you tomorrow night.
Good night.
Bye.